So on behalf of the sponsors, Johnson County Community College and the Center for Global Peace Journalism at Park University, once again, welcome. I ask my students, as you would in class, to please turn your cameras on. And at this point then, and by the way, this session will be recorded. So let me turn it over to educator and journalist, Louis Duguid, who is our moderator today. Sir.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the fourth session of the 2020 Greater Kansas City Peacebuilding Conference. And thank you, Steve. This fall, we've been hosting 3 months of peace focused on the theme of building peace through social justice. The conference is co-sponsored by Johnson County Community College and the Center for Global Peace Journalism at Park University. My name is Louis Duguid. I was a longtime journalist with the Kansas City Star, and now I'm an author, lecturer, freelance writer, and political action committee chair for the National Association for Multicultural Education. Today, I'm your moderator. First, some housekeeping. As we've heard earlier, we're recording this session, so if you have concerns about that, please take the appropriate steps now, such as turning off your video. For our program, if you have any questions, our presenter will leave, or if you have any questions for our presenter, please put them in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. I will share your questions with our presenter, who will leave time at the end of his program to provide answers. Our 2020 Greater Kansas City Peacebuilding Conference began in September, examining the mainstream media's influence on peace building and social justice. In October, the conference focused on colonial history in such places as Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India, with efforts of Mahatma Gandhi and others insisting on freedom and peace, followed by today's societal and diplomatic outreach promoting social justice and peace globally. If you missed the earlier programs, I encourage you to Google the 2020 Greater Kansas City Peacebuilding Conference to view recordings of those sessions, which have been posted on the website, jcc.edu/conferences/peacebuilding, and I will put that in the chat box. Our presenter today is the Reverend Eric Garbison, co-founder and director of Cherith Brooks Catholic Worker House. Reverend Garbison grew up in Des Moines, Iowa, but raised his family in Kansas City. He followed a long-time calling to become a Presbyterian minister, but admits his work is more ecumenical. He was first brought to this area to serve a church in Overland Park, although he bought a house in Kansas City, Missouri, wanting to live in an integrated community east of Troost Avenue. Reverend Garbison says his heart and work were drawn to the Catholic worker community. He has been connected with Cherith Brooks Catholic Worker House at 3308 East 12th Street in Northeast Kansas City since 2006. It is a community where people affected by poverty are given a voice in leadership and encouraged to face various forms of internalized oppression through nonviolent ways of living. It is at Cherith Brooks that Reverend Garbison describes himself as just one person in a house of hospitality in Kansas City. Mr. Garbison will speak with you today on the topic of solidarity, not charity, building peace through mutual aid and faith activism. Reverend Garbison.
Thanks. So my co-convener here, Miss Lois Swimmer. I don't know if Louis, I sent you a bio for her. I don't know if you have that.
I don't think I got that.
Okay, I might in the middle of this try to pull that up. At least here. Let me see if I can find that real quick, because I apologize for that, Lois. So if I could introduce my co-conspirator in this work here. Lois is a very important part of Cherith Brooks Catholic Worker. As a leader, she has been a part of the work here for 7 or 8 years now, and Lois is a grandmother. She's a mother. She's a Lakota native-born woman raised in the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe reservation in South Dakota. She is an activist, going back to working for the freedom of Leonard Peltier back in her younger days. And since she's been living here in Kansas City for several decades now, has been involved in work for advocating for living wage, for affordable housing, been an active part and is a member, is the one of the Missouri representatives for the National Poor People's Campaign, a national call for a moral revival. And she is part of what we call at Cherith Brook, the Elder Circle of leadership here in our work, and as we're going to kind of unfold it a little bit. So Lois is going to take her mic off so that she can jump in, and we're going to kind of tag team this together. You got that off yet, Lois? If you put your cursor at the bottom left-hand corner, you can turn the mic off. So I think I can share my PowerPoint while she's figuring that out. All right, so I wonder how many of you have, so we're going to talk today about the difference between solidarity and charity. We often think of charitable work as something all of us should be a part of, maybe benign and neutral, but definitely important for the life of a community. And I just want to give you a brief introduction of our particular expression of communal life. I don't know if any of you have heard of Dorothy Day and the Catholic Worker. If you haven't, I invite you to study this seminal American figure who founded the Catholic Worker movement, which is not to be confused with the Catholic Church or, say, Catholic Charities. Although she was converted to Catholicism as an adult, she was a radical. She was a socialist. She was very involved with communism, or the Communist Party. She was a journalist, as you can see in the left-hand picture. She was a spiritual leader, a mystic, as you can maybe see in her walking through the woods. She was an activist.
Mine went off.
Okay. Can you grab Levi to help you?
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. If you look at the right-hand corner, if any of you have heard of Cesar Chavez, this was in the farm workers boycott in California. This is by the time she's an older woman. I think it was when she was 79, she died at the year of 80. And here she is protesting. And this was the last time she was arrested for civil disobedience, sitting in a field, a vineyard with the farm workers in California. So if you don't know about Dorothy Day, she founded the Catholic Worker movement, a movement of houses of hospitality, very informal, every decentralized houses. There's not a central office or a hierarchy in the Catholic Worker movement. We're all independent houses, living off of the same inspiration. And there's probably 250 houses throughout the United States. You might have driven by a house and not even known it, because we're just a part of the community in which we live in often cases, and there's not always this kind of clear sense that this is anything but a house in the community. The aims and means of the Catholic Worker, this is reflected in Cherith Brook in particular, but it overlaps with the Catholic Worker movement more broadly, is our commitment to nonviolence as a way of life. For us in particular, hospitality is very central, but not only the welcome and the invite of people on the margins, but how it's done, which brings us into a sense of community, because we live together in our communal life. There are residents here who live at the house committed to the work, but all of us ultimately are volunteers. So we live here, we may get housing benefits, but those of us who actually live in the house, in the storefront that we have at Cherith Brook, we get room and board, and then we work outside the home for some of the other needs that we have. We're a spiritual community, a Christian community, and we practice a form of simplicity, of simple living, which sometimes we call, if you're someone coming out of white privilege, you might refer to it as downward mobility, moving into different kinds of interactions with people in ways that don't always tap into your privilege. And then the Catholic Worker, initially, Dorothy, was deeply committed to the labor movement and to returning to the land. So talking about this back in the height of the Industrial Revolution, the first Catholic Worker houses began in the 30s. So during the time of the Industrial Revolution, when New York was filled with deep poverty, down in the Bowery of New York is where the Mother House is. And they had farming communes where people would go from the urban core to the farm to labor on the land to grow their own food. So that's a little overview of the Catholic worker movement and a sense of what Cherith Brook is about. I will add this last thing. Let me just jump. I don't know, for time's sake. You will see this mural on the outside of our building. It's a Dorothy Day quote. It actually is, she's quoting scripture, or loosely, New Testament. But she says, "We know God through the breaking of bread, and we know each other through the breaking of bread, and we are not alone anymore." So one of the things unique about the Catholic worker, and it's being centered in hospitality, is that there's something about table fellowship in the Christian tradition, Eucharist or the Lord's Supper. There's something about sitting down and eating with one another that has a transformative, a mysterious, a mystical outcome in our lives, breaking down barriers that we often create that cause hostility, animosity, difference, negative difference, or division. And we can't always understand how it becomes the sum of all its parts. We just do it, and oftentimes these things begin to happen among us that we can't always understand are happening. The outcomes are often much bigger than our efforts, the efforts we seem to be giving into it. So in the Christian tradition, we call that God at work with us, moving us and motivating us, and the Spirit of Christ among us. Because if you can see in this particular mural, I don't know if you can see, I'd be curious if somebody wants to turn their mic off, what they notice about that image, because I think it's helpful to reflect on it. Does anyone see anything interesting about that image? This is a version of the Last Supper. If that were the case, where is Christ? If you know that tradition. Well, the way Dorothy would respond to it is she would say, Christ is actually in every face around that table. The Christ figure is every person around that table. The Christ figure, that's the clear Christ figure, is at the bottom of our circle with dreadlocks, and he's got his hands out, and you can't see, but there are, he's got his hands out in an open, welcoming, receptive, inviting kind of posture. So for us, peacemaking starts at the table, and our justice work starts at the table, and it emanates from there. And we see very powerful symbolism and realities in the practicing of welcoming people to table. So today I want to talk about charity versus mutual aid, and we have been discussing this in our community. I want to see if Lois is back yet. Lois, are you there? I'm sorry if we lose her. I might just have her come up here. I just lost my screen share. I'm sorry. I'm a novice at this yet. I haven't taught on this yet, so there we go. Steve, where do I go to get my screen share back option back?
Your screen share is on, Eric.
Oh, it is on. Okay, good. All right.
Yeah.
I'm just not seeing it. Okay. Oh, I see what I've done. Okay, my bad. So we often get, so the work we do, our commitment to nonviolence and hospitality are an important combination. And one of the things people come to us as volunteers, and one of the things we spend time dealing with is that people, the posture that they bring into charitable work, they often bring into the kind of hospitality that we do. And so we've spent some time here in the last couple of months as a community talking about the difference between charity and mutual aid. And Dorothy Day early on was saying churches and communities and individuals need to be committed to mutual aid. And she was often having to combat the distinction between, or I articulate the difference between mutual aid and charity. So I want us to reflect today as we're talking about what we've been discussing in our community through looking through these different questions. So as you think about any charitable organization you might be a part of, especially as it might relate to people experiencing homelessness on the streets, which is the people that often come to our hospitality space. We offer meals and people come and take a shower. We're known on the streets as the Shower House. That's the name we've been given. People come for showers and clothing. They get their mail at our address. They use the phone. So when we're doing our hospitality and our welcome, these are the questions we need to think about and how it might contrast with the ways charity is seen today in the broader society. So who controls the resources in the work? Who makes the decisions about who gets in and who gets out and who gets access and how things go, how things are run, what is centered or prioritized in the work? And how are those decisions made? What is the process? What does it look like? Why do people participate? What motivates them to come to a place like Cherith Brook Catholic Worker and give their time and their energy? And who are those people? And how do they participate? And how does charity versus mutual aid define the set of problems that we're dealing with in our society? So those are kind of quick questions we're going to go through here. And I've just associated a set of images with it. Okay. Is Lois there yet? I don't see her. All right. Sorry, we're at two different buildings, so I'm not able to help her troubleshoot what she's got going on. So who controls the resources? When you're talking about charity, when we think about charity, where does charity often get its resources? Well, from donors, of course, sometimes on an individual basis. But generally, the resources often come on large-scale charitable organizations through grants and through philanthropy. And this is a really important question to us because oftentimes you don't have access to those resources unless you're a staff person or a trustee or a board member or a giver, a donor who might stipulate where you think is the best place for those resources to go. And in that case, people at the top of this system are deciding what's best for people. Mutual aid, if you look in this picture here, in mutual aid, the resources we get, whether they're food or whether it's money or maybe it's clothes or whatever, and how they get passed on, there's this awareness that that everyone has need and everyone has resources. So for example, the resources for food we buy very little food. We get most of it. We try to rescue it before it hits the dumpster or the landfill. So you want to join me? Why don't you bring it over here and you can sit beside me, okay? Or why don't you just join me, okay? Can you grab that bench? Yeah, okay. So, right here. So someone may have an access or an abundance of something, but then be shy of something else. So when people are bringing things to the table, there's this mutuality because someone has a need and a want, and I provide what you need, and I have something that you might be able to provide for me. And so there's a sense in which it's working out of this sense of the community having an abundance of resources or having resources they need when you know where to look or when people are contributing on an equal basis. And at that point, then people realize that we give on the basis of where the need is, and it's a little less, it's more motivated by who's in the community at the time and who has the need, and how we can get it to them as beautifully as possible. That might also it begins to open up a broader sense of what resources are, which include people's gifts and people's time and people's skills and people's intellect and people's passion and people's faith and these kind of aspects. So secondly, who makes the decisions? How are the decisions made? And I'm going to have Lois here give an example of how this has worked for us recently in light of living in a COVID reality. And I'll talk about the picture in a minute, but I'm going to let her talk about our decision for this. You can look at that if you want. I'll let you talk about you were going to give the example of the living in COVID times and the decisions that we made. So how we made some decisions greatly about winter hospitality.
Yes. During this time here, we had to make really difficult decisions of how to deal with our guests that are homeless and out here in this winter. So we all got together as a community here at Cherith Brook and came up with a decision of staying open through this crisis. It was a battle, but it was a good battle for me. We fed a lot of people yet at the same time. The decision that it came down to was how to keep our hospitality going and to keep our community open. And we made a lot of we asked a lot of our guests for input, and we got a lot of feedback back. So the decisions that we made were all of us as a community to get together to keep it open. We got our tents, we got our heat. Mr. Chris here, he got this building, this nice little heater, another little barrel heater here. That was a decision from all of us here at Cherith Brook, and as far as all the community and our homeless guests. So that was amazing there.
When we first started out during COVID, we've been serving meals outside for all of the summer period, rain and shine. And that was the safest way we could figure to offer food to our guests, because our community honestly is marginalized enough that if COVID comes to them, it's through us, probably, those who have a little more mobility socially. So we finally adapted to that, but then as we were aware of winter coming, we can't serve food outside. So what was going to be the alternative? So you can kind of see it in this picture, but you could shut that door. Sorry, the cat wants to join us. This is DJ. He's the third participant. We had to decide what to do. And so we told our guests as they were coming, we need help troubleshooting this issue. And so we had several meetings with guests and volunteers and community members and residents of Cherith Brook. We met for several times to kind of brainstorm what our options are. And we went through several layers of ideas where people were in small groups discussing and throwing out ideas. And it was powerful to see the consensus that emerged as we were brainstorming over this period of time. And you can barely see at the corner, there's a carport. What we ended up doing was purchasing 2 carports putting them together. And we have heaters. So we're able to serve a couple of groups outside, as well as bring in small groups into our cafe, because we'll have in the morning, we only have room for 10 people in our small cafe with COVID restrictions. We used to have 40 or 50. So now we have space in the carports in the cafe, and we have a system where we're trying to learn this system before it gets too cold. But a lot of that whole process and even the finer details of that happened through this conversation. I give this barrel image because this little project was one of our guests who's undocumented, and who's blind from diabetes, but has built these in his culture several times and gave instruction to Chris, who's the welder right there. And then one of our other guests said, I know where a barrel is in the neighborhood, and I'll go see if people will donate it. So just a little symbol of the way mutuality works. All right, we'll go to number 3. Why do people participate? Well, I guess I should compare that. So how does that work in a charitable model? How do decisions get made? Well, oftentimes they get made by staff members. They get made by donors. They get made, again, by board members, part of the structure. And they often get told to people in the community life. Without that, oftentimes, in some cases, without any kind of interaction or input from the people whose lives are being impacted either by poverty or by racism or by cultural challenges and injustices. They don't get a voice in those decisions. So how do we do that within a model, a service of hospitality? So this third question, why do people participate? What brings them to the table? In the charitable model, of course, it's often people who are educated and paid to play a role, which is very important in society in many cases. That's on the surface of things. we're more aware in society that there are other things that motivate people. In our work and in hospitality, one of the temptations even for us can be kind of the saviorism sense in which I'm coming to this community, or I'm in this community to rescue people, to save people, because this kind of sense of even paternalism that we have what they need and we have the insights that they need to deal with issues that their community is facing. So how are we careful to navigate that? And let me just put the caveat here that all the things I'm saying about charitable organizations are things that we struggle with at the same time in which we're trying to articulate new ways of, or embody new ways of doing these things. So why do people participate? Often they find a personal reward of satisfaction or a sense of faith. Maybe they're motivated by the faith. All those things can be good, except for some of the challenges I articulated. But what about people who come from within the community in a mutual aid model? What does that look like? Why do people participate who are coming from the community to express their mutuality? What's one of the ideas that you were talking about earlier, Lois?
Well, they feel welcomed when they're asked to participate in any of our things that we do. And one of them said, we participate to help because we want for this place to thrive and somewhere to go and put their skills to at work. And as you see, these two gentlemen here are part of our guests, and they came and helped put up the other tent. So they're here to participate too, so they can have somewhere to go to and help the others out there on the streets that they know. And they get such reward out of it that they feel so welcomed here, so loved here, and which they are.
The woman on the left is her name is Tammy, and I won't talk too much about her personal story, but Tammy, I think, highlights one of the impacts it has when you, because people come because they've been impacted personally by poverty, they've been impacted personally by racism, by the interconnectedness of injustices in our world, and they come because they're angry about it. They come to help because I'm angry and I need to channel my anger. They come because they understand what other people are going through around them who are also needing these services and support. Tammy came to Cherith Brook probably 12 years ago as a guest for several years. Now Tammy is one of the leaders in our community. She still lives in the Northeast neighborhood where we're located. And she cooks a couple days a week, or one day a week, and she leads other days a week. And she's been very involved in our political activism as well. And just that sense in which when you create a model where the walls are more permeable, there's less us and them, we believe that results in a deeper commitment to transformation, to self-realization, to equality in the community. So give me a heads up if I'm moving in my time. I don't see a calendar on or a clock on my screen right just yet. But okay, how do people participate? This is a really important one. Dorothy Day said, people love it when I feed the poor. They hate it when I ask, why are people poor? They call me a communist when I ask, why are people hungry? They're glad for me to feed the hungry, but they don't want to ask the question of why, which is, you saw the images already of us offering hospitality, welcoming people to the table. And that's a really key, important part of how we participate as a mutual aid community. And you would experience that in some beautiful ways in a charitable organization as well, this welcome of guests and welcome of people. There's some work out there that's really amazing in terms of breaking down some of the barriers we're even talking about. But one thing you don't often see is at charity, and there's an assumption that can't be done, is to invite the community to be more advocates for the injustices that are creating the need for the charity. Okay, and there's a deep connection between charitable work, philanthropic work, and late capitalism, and the one needs the other in some deep ways. So one of the ways mutual aid invites us to participate is through political education and activism. We believe deeply that the people closest to the bottom are closest to the solutions. Maybe you've heard that statement before. The people closest to the bottom are closest to the solutions. And when we quiet their voices, we often we control the outcomes in many ways. So you can see images here of the different ways that our community, we do political education. We've talked about voting. There's a real resistance to voting among people on the streets. they haven't seen it impact their lives. So we've had some pretty deep and long conversations about voting, and as a form of civil or as a form of nonviolent peacemaking in a democratic structure. Here you also see we're not afraid to hit the streets, whether it's with KC tenants advocating for affordable housing. Now, when somebody gets out there and holds a sign who has experienced what it's like to not be able to have access to affordable housing in a city that claims that affordable housing is about $1,200 a month, right? Then we can address and combat the myths about that get put out there in the system that don't really speak to the truth of people's real experiences. Or if you look here at Jamie, she's the one sitting by the table, and we had a panel, the Poor People's Campaign had a panel discussion. We invited both Governor Parson and candidate Callaway to a discussion about what they were going to do about poverty and racism in Missouri. And Jamie's on that Zoom discussion in our cafe. She sleeps outside, came in the evening to be a part of a panel discussion, someone who's deeply impacted by these issues because she's sleeping outside in the cold. And of course, Governor Parsons didn't even show up to the conversation, but we were able to press in on candidate Callaway about those issues. I don't know if there's anything else you want to say about how people participate. If I could brag on Lois a little bit here down the left-hand corner, if you're familiar with the Poor People's Campaign, the National Poor People's Campaign, here she is with Reverend Dr. Barber and Reverend Liz Theoharis, the co-conveners of the Poor People's Campaign in Washington, D.C. She was representing her tribe at this event, a national gathering. There were 10,000 people on the mall in D.C. And this was this is a couple years ago now, and we've been very active. Or maybe it's political education. The racism unity picture you see at the top, we had 25 people from the streets of the Northeast come to a meeting on what white nationalism does in our community. What a great piece of information to train ourselves with. We didn't have consensus in that group about the event, but we had a really powerful discussion. So just some examples of other ways people participate in a mutual aid model. Finally, how are the problems defined in a mutual aid model? And I have two pictures up here to kind of reflect. Well, let me just say back to the number 4. The reason this is really important is because you don't go to soup kitchens often, and we don't do enough of saying, maybe on an individual level, people can go and participate at a protest for Black Lives Matter, or at a protest for living wage in Kansas City with Stand Up KC. But that's not encouraged in charitable models. In fact, it's probably discouraged. And that's important to name, that as organizations, as communities, why aren't they investing in dealing with some of the solutions? Well, part of it's because of number 5. I think some charitable models define the problems differently than in mutual aid. And we've already landed on this a little bit, but if you look at the banner at that DC event, it says fight poverty, not the poor. Oftentimes in charitable models, the poor are the problem, right? Maybe it's not their fault necessarily. Maybe they just haven't had a chance at education or good jobs. Or maybe there is a moral judgment involved in that. The poor are blamed for their poverty, and for people of color are blamed for their struggles in life because maybe they have addiction issues, or maybe there's a religious tone put over, like they're not right with God. And that often is some of the ways that the problems that they're experiencing get framed. In mutual aid model, the problems are, it's not the problem of the poor, it's that we have to join together and fight poverty together. The problems, for example, of poverty are really directly related to living wages and available affordable housing. Those are at the top of the list of the statistics. Issues of things like addiction and mental health in poor communities and more middle class and wealthy communities, the percentages are pretty close together. It's just the difference is that people in poor communities like the Northeast neighborhood don't have that social net to fall back on. They don't have family members or resources to access.
Or they're even scared to they're probably scared to even ask somebody for help or anything like that. And like you said, as far as like the voting, a lot of them didn't know if they could, or if they had a record or any kind of record, they did not know because they were not informed. And that's the problem. We need to get out there and inform them if they and let them so they can hear, let the voices be heard. Yeah, we need to solve these problems.
So in the mutual aid, the way we look at the problem is in the injustices in our system. The injustices that even manifest themselves in our own ways of short-sightedness, even at a place like Cherith Brook Catholic Worker. So learning to reframe the issues around poverty as being intersectional, right? Racism and when you begin to unpack the issues of racism, you have to address the issue of poverty. When you look at poverty, you have to see how the environmental issues we're facing are disproportionately affecting people of color and people in poverty. And then how our military industrial complex steals money from our communities to bloat our society's military and the resources that we could have available to us, or even thinking of alternative ways to invest in what makes for peace, the peace building in our community. So the mutual aid model challenges us to think differently about how we define the problems. Here's just a good image of what that might look like. It doesn't address all the things we're talking about, but if you can see how mutual aid pulls the community together. If I were to summarize some of the things maybe I haven't said, I would just say mutual aid is a kind of a decentralized vision, and it's very participatory. How do we take from our community what we need? It doesn't mean we don't need things outside of our community. It doesn't mean we don't need allies, but how do we invite deeper participation on all levels?
So excuse me, Eric and Louis, just wanted to tell you, we have about 15 minutes remaining. So we want a stop at 12:55, please. Please
Great.
Continue.
Yeah, I'll just say one, leaders emerge from the community, the bottom one. The community participates in deciding what the priorities are. And one thing we didn't address is one of the difference between who participates is what are the barriers to keeping people even for access to basic needs like food and shelter and clothing. We have ways of layering that, like we decide some people are worthy and some people are unworthy. So even in sometimes accessing shelters today, now you have to have certain forms of identification to be able to have a roof over your head at a shelter environment. So what are the kinds of layers that we put in? At Cherith Brook, you give us whatever name you want. If you need the resource, you come in and you get what you need. And there's that sense of openness and permeability that we try to create a space where it's not based on how society determines who deserves to have access. I think I can stop there. That's a mouthful.
We do have some questions that have been added to the chat box. One is how has the coronavirus pandemic affected Cherith Brook's mission?
How's it affected our mission?
Yes, sir. The work that you do.
Well, I guess the way I would answer that, I'll let Lois answer how she wants, but at that beginning, I showed the image of the hospitality sitting at table. So obviously the springboard to our kind of rejuvenating our interrelations with one another, mutuality with one another. If it's by table fellowship, that doesn't really work, right? It's been very challenging, the stress that we feel. We live at the space we serve. The stress that we feel in navigating it on a personal level, the COVID realities and dangers. For our community members, people who may have pre-existing conditions or the age, we lost a lot of volunteers. We lost some volunteers who would come who were older and didn't want to be in a public space. But we have lines of people now, which we tend to be resistant to lines, right? We don't want to create lines. We want to create open spaces. And just trying to get people the resources they need, we've often felt difficult to mirror, and we're wearing masks, right? So much of our welcome is very gesture oriented and relational based, and we can't do. So I think we've struggled with the same kind of things that everyone has struggled with, and the intimacy that we need to really build and nurture community. The second thing I will say is this: is our activism. It's proven our own weaknesses and the reality of the technology divide, right? So we had 30 people a week at a meeting for the Poor People's a month, I'm sorry, at a meeting for the Poor People's Campaign, and we were doing participating in one activity a month in the community. When COVID hit, we couldn't bring 30 people into our cafe, and we didn't have the technology to get them access. Like the National Poor People's Campaign went online, right? Everything was through phones and laptops. Well, our community does have access to some phones, but where do they get Wi-Fi? Well, the coffee shops and the libraries that are now closed, or the community centers that are now closed. So it really affected our ability to participate when everything went digital and we didn't have those kind of resources. I don't know if you want to add.
Another question
Yeah,
is,
it was kind of difficult to try to transit to online, and like you said, you know, some of us don't have the technology or computers or anything like that, but our mission is still there, and we're still doing what we need to do out there with our guests. And I really feel that we're still learning of how to deal with of how we're going to go about when it gets colder. So we're still working out the kinks, and that's our mission, is to help our guests out there and listen to their input, because they do got a lot of input of how to do things, or give us a few words of how to build something, or maybe just give us some advice, and we listen.
another question, and I guess this goes to the basics, is how is Cherith Brooks funded?
We're funded by a lot of sweat labor. So in the Catholic tradition, there's the Benedictine and the Franciscans. The Benedicts work and pray, and the Franciscans beg. And so I would say a combination of those. Our largest donors usually give something like $5, $10, $15, or bring us a meal, or whatever. But because we don't have, our buildings are already owned, and they're owned they belong to a community trust. So the sweat equity of people's volunteering and the resources we need are usually, we don't have staff, so we don't have to pay salaries and that kind of thing. So we make it on about anywhere from $50,000 to $70,000 a year. We do the work that we do, depending on the year and what needs arise. So we just ask, and we have occasionally a large donation of something, but mostly it's the simple little things, which kind of makes sense with the way we see the world.
Now, how does Cherith Brooks measure or evaluate the efficacy of your work?
Right.
How do you know you're succeeding?
Yeah, one of the beautiful parts of why don't you ask that question first? How would you see the efficacy of our work? Oh, you can't hear the question, can you? How do we see that our work is effective? How do we measure the effectiveness of our work and the success?
I see. I see some of the success that we made with some of our guests. They come. We haven't seen them for a while. We wonder about them, how they're doing, how they're feeling. Are they doing good? In some of the cases, we had one she's doing really great. She's got a job. She's got her own place now, and that's the kind of feeling that I would like to see in every one of our guests, that they can make it and they have the will to make it, instead of staying out on the streets. But we do a lot of work here too. We don't have the PhD or anything, no frame on the wall there saying that we psychologists or whatever, but we do try to listen to some of them, just because they need that ear, and we provide that. We provide a lot of that here. We try to make their lives maybe a little easier when they leave here. We try.
Okay.
And I would simply add to that, that Dorothy Day was very clear, like success, we're driven by our faithfulness and by our call to love. The love is the only solution. Love is the measure and love is the solution. And I don't mean that in kind of a frilly way. As you see, we're very deeply ingrained in the realities and the suffering of that happens in people's lives. We're deeply immersed in that. I mean that in a very hard and challenging way, that love is commitment and long-term longevity. But I think to not focus in on success or failure, we don't keep track of how many meals we've served or the statistics of that. What we tend to value is the long-term relationships that we have. So when I go to Price Chopper to get groceries, I'll often run into someone who I've known as a guest or a friend, either because I see them every week and I still am, and hey, how's it going? How you doing this week? Or I haven't seen you down at the house for a minute. Or someone who visited once and said, you're from the Shower House. Oh yeah, we've met and we relate. And so that experience of community for people who really find it hard to imagine that there's a lot of mobility for them in their life, because poverty often makes you feel like there's a challenge of experiencing that sense of, I'm going to go get a PhD or I'm going to get a new professional job or whatever. And for communities, sticking together is one of the successes that we have. That's very tangible.
Okay, I think we've got time for a couple more questions. One is
Hold on,
there any?
you have to say that again, Louis. I'm sorry.
We have time for 2 more questions. One is there any effort at Cherith Brooks to connect people who are out of work to jobs and to get people who are in poverty on their feet and on their own?
So the question is there any effort at Cherith Brook to connect people with jobs and get people on their feet and on their own? I would say that question sounds a lot like how the problem is defined. In a society of rugged individualism, we assume that there's a sense in which we can be on our own. And that person may not have meant the question that way, but that's how I hear it. We are a community that sees how deeply interconnected we are, and jobs are really important. And of course, I would hope that you would have seen in the images of us fighting for a living wage, fighting for 15 in the union. Dr. Vernon Howard, who's here on this call, and SCLC and the organizations that he gathered around were very instrumental in helping to raise the minimum wage in Kansas City, which then was taken away abruptly by the state, right? That is how someone is going to benefit. What people know is that if any of you in this conversation have tried to live off of $740 a month, then you tell me why you would bother to get a job that pays you $8, $9, $10 an hour. So something has to fundamentally change. That's why the justice work is the way that we are helping people get access to employment. It's to better employment, to a livable employment. If you are a student here, go on the MIT's wage calculator. They have a website that it tells you the zip code you live in and how much you should be making. You as a student, you as an adult, what you need to be making with your life circumstances. If you're a single mom with a child, or you are a young adult, or you have a family of 3, in your zip code, what you should be making, because our wages have not raised for 40 years to go along with inflation. So that's how we are helping people, is by fighting to have better wages, not by just simply connecting them to work. There are people who are doing that, and on a day-to-day basis, people need work, but it's really hard to work your ass off and to not be able to make it, to work 2 or 3 jobs and to not be able to make it in our society. The 3 leading employers of the United States are who? Does anybody know? The 3 leading employers today: McDonald's, Yum Brands, and Walmart. And those people intentionally train their folks to get on food stamps and to live underemployed with not a full 40-hour week or plus. So that's really that's the problem. That's the problem as we see it.
Last question. Because we're in the presidential election, which candidate do you think would benefit Sheriff Brooks now the most as president?
Which candidate do you think would benefit Sheriff Brooks most as a candidate?
Oh, that's a tough issue. I'll stick with Biden.
I personally would say neither of them. Our job at Sheriff Brooks is not to advocate for a candidate. In both cases, we're going to have to fight for them to fulfill their obligations to our community. And if we're not pressuring, they all make promises, right? Every president has made promises for one reason or another, and some of them have meant, and some of them they've only meant to get elected. So part of our job is to elect a candidate we think is for the people. And I think it's pretty clear in the issues that we've brought up and in the way that we see the problem, who that might be. But even then, you elect that person and you still have to put their foot to the fire. Okay. We're seeing that right now with Mayor Clinton Lucas, right? That he is not willing to bring about the reforms that are needed in the Kansas City Police Department. And our people suffer under police brutality in our neighborhood. They suffer every day under police brutality. People of color, people in poverty. And there's plenty of documentation to that fact. And even during the protests, the way the protesters were treated, it's clear. And the community complaints department, we've had personal experience here at Sheriff Brooks about the way the community complaints department is toothless and it's ineffective, and it's because police chief is the one who makes final decisions. And if you make a complaint and there was any chance that your complaint was being heard, for example, in our Kansas City Police Department, you would never know the outcome of that on the officers. They are not required to make public if that would even happen. Like I think one year there was 120 complaints and maybe 2 were accepted as legitimate. That's not possible in our society today for only 2 of 120 or 150 complaints to be recognized as being significant. So that's an example. So yeah, we can vote for Mayor Clinton Lucas, and then we have to press in on him and say, you need to do what's best for the community and to continue to advocate for our needs.
That activism is important. I want to thank everyone for tuning into this session. It's been great, as have
let me invite you all to Sheriff Brooks. Come down anytime. We're on 12th and Benton, and you'll recognize us by the mural that you saw a picture of, by the chickens in the back and the ducks. They always like to make a lot of noise. We are surrounded by one of our contributions to our own life is some food we produce for our table. So you'll notice a large garden and orchard around our spaces that's there to contribute something to every meal we have. We don't claim to be some kind of sustainable community, but it's a piece of our work that brings beauty as well as a chance to labor for our own food and understand that connectivity.
Well, thanks.
So let me, in closing, thank our moderator, Louis Duguid, our friends from Sheriff Brooks. We have another session that begins in about 5 minutes. The link to that session is posted in the chat. We also have some excellent sessions tomorrow. One about racism featuring the Reverend Dr. Howard, who's with us right now. A second one about healthcare with Councilwoman Melissa Robinson. And a final one tomorrow night with Mayor Lucas discussing gun violence. Thank you again for being here today. We'll see you in about 5 minutes, or if not, tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. God bless you all.